Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Webdelics podcast, where we're on a journey to find out the truth about plant medicine, get rid of the myths, and change the narrative. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and with us today is our guest, Diego Ugalde. Diego is a veteran with over 15 years of experience as a Navy SEAL. He served 3 combat tours in Iraq and participated in over 250 highly classified operations in combat and advanced special operations. Diego was awarded 4 Navy Commendation Medals with combat valor, 3 Navy Achievement Medals, and 1 Combat Action Ribbon. Today, Diego is the CEO and founder of the Trident Approach, a leadership consultancy firm, as well as a psychedelic integration coach. Diego, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate you having me.
Thank you. And I'm really excited about the episode today because it is something that I would never, ever have imagined having an actual conversation about, even after I signed on to be the host of this show. Now, so far on the show, we've talked about what psychedelics are, how they impact our culture, and even how they could affect our personal lives. We've gone so far as discussed the relationship of psychedelics to yoga. All of these things are discussion points that I might not have imagined in advance, but all have been fascinating and really brought the relevance of psychedelics into the day-to-day experience of folks just like me. Yours, though, is perhaps the most unexpected of all, because we're talking about the relationship of psychedelics and leadership, particularly psychedelic use, for lack of a better word right now, as a leadership development modality. So let me just start by asking you a let's keep it real sort of question here. Diego,
Okay.
Are you telling me that in order to be a great leader, you need to have done psychedelics?
Well, 100% no. Not at all. In fact, I don't even think that I don't think that psychedelics are right for everybody. Well, I could say I know that they're not right for everybody wherever they're at in their specific places in life. I just happened to stumble upon them when kind of my whole life was focused towards leadership. And then when I kind of came out of the medicine, I was like, whoa, there's all of this stuff that I wish I'd always known that applies to all of this thing. And so, however, just like everything else with psychedelics, it's not teaching you anything, special. It's just aligning you closer to truth. And so really psychedelics, I think, can have a really huge impact on everything you do in life, whether it's being a parent or being a friend or whatever it is. It's the taboo of psychedelics, I think, is kind of over the top. But just getting in alignment with the truth, I think, can apply to anything.
So you've said a few things in here that we're going to want to explore more deeply, and I'm actually really interested to do so. But let's step back a little bit. You said a minute ago that basically psychedelics can help you get in alignment with truth. And as I was processing that statement, I had to ask myself, from your perspective, what exactly is leadership? Because some might argue that leadership doesn't require that you be aligned with the truth. Is that statement even correct? What does leadership mean?
Well, leadership to me means inspiring and motivating others around you. That's really about it. To get them to do things that they ultimately want to do, that maybe they didn't necessarily know they could do without you. And that's not an egoic thing. It's just sometimes all of us at some point need help, and we need a little pushing, a little extra motivation. And so really that's what leadership is. So leadership is like almost every interaction in life. I mean, at the gas station or wherever it is, you can look at it like that and it could still be genuine. It's not always limited to, the football field or the boardroom.
Right.
Yeah.
And when you talk then about alignment with truth, Why do you think that matters with regards to leadership? I know, and a lot of people are going to be listening to this and saying, of course, alignment with truth matters, Scott. But let's face it, there have been people that have been enormously successful as leaders, at least if you view it from an egoic perspective, without any sort of alignment with truth. They've been called unethical leaders, sometimes dictators. So talk to me a little bit about the relationship then of those two and why you think that alignment with truth actually is relevant to this discussion.
Well, let me first start off by describing at least my understanding of truth. And to me, what is true is always true. So something can't be true if it's like only sometimes it is or something. Usually almost always when people talk about truth, it's the way I see it, they're really just describing their biasness, their perspective, their experience, their prejudices, all these things. And then, so this whole idea, this thing that's running around, your truth, my truth, his truth, that doesn't necessarily resonate with me so low when I really kind of dig into the kind of the soul of what that word is. So the reason why truth matters so much to me as I think about it in context of leadership is there are many times where the mind can go running off in all kinds of directions that aren't necessarily aligned in truth. They could be going down the road of fear, or just afraid something's going to happen, or his expectations or judgments or attachments and all these things, and they can help people make all kinds of decisions that are rooted in fear. They're rooted in this protective mechanism, or they're rooted in confinement. And so, you were talking about dictators and like some of these toxic leaders. At the end of the day, all of those things, as far as I can tell, there's a shelf life to it. It only lasts so long because people are only capable of doing so much when it's out of alignment with who they really are. So when you're leading from a place of truth or love, and helping and aiding people to step into their power of maybe who they were supposed to be their whole lives, to me, that is endless. Because they're capable of doing so much. They're achieving even beyond your control, that's leadership, because I don't have any buy-in to what you're doing. I just want to see you do amazing things. And if you're doing amazing things in the spirit of what the organization is trying to do, then, how can you resist that? How can you argue with that?
It's interesting. I'm hearing as you talk then about leadership, not just actually viewing it from the most superficial perspective, which is perhaps what we initially started the conversation with, i.e. being able to galvanize people to achieve an outcome, but in a way from an ideal perspective and one that's sustainable, being able to liberate the human spirit to be able to rally behind a goal that's positive and that is liberating, at least potentially, to others. Am I hearing you right there?
100%. 100%. I think what happens a lot of times in these organizations is people, these hiring HR or whoever's doing the hiring is looking at these people and looking at their resume and looking at their qualifications and skills and things like, this is what we need as part of our team. And the moment that person shows up, they immediately just like strap them with rules and regulations and restrictions, and you better not do this, and you need to do this. And all of that talent, all that genius, all that power, all that emotion is now just, what do you want me to do? Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. I love the quote by Steve Jobs where he's like, we don't hire smart people and tell them what to do. I hire smart people so that they can tell me what to do. And I think, I understand he's controversial and all that, but it doesn't matter. What I think that single quote to me is just so powerful, and it's something that I lean on a lot, even within my own organization.
As much as that sort of idea about what leadership is has traveled into the larger public discourse around leadership, there are many, many, many organizations in which the spirit of it actually hasn't taken hold. I've worked for many of them. So I speak from experience, and I'm sure a lot of folks that are listening to or watching this are also working for such organizations or may have worked for them before. when we talk then about liberating the human spirit to be what it can be to further this goal, perhaps that's where I'm beginning to see a link between psychedelics and leadership. Am I just inventing things here, though, making links where I want them to be?
No, sir.
Or is there an
That's
actual
exactly
link?
how I see it. That is precisely how I see it. One of the things that I've learned over time since doing psychedelics for the first time is that you have to have something within your experience to actually understand it, right? So, like a big one, a very easy one to understand is if the first time somebody told me, "Hey, Diego, you're not your thoughts," I was like, "Okay," you know, it didn't mean it. Like, okay, it sounds good. I'm not my thoughts, but it took me iteration after iteration after iteration and integration and really, really digging into them. Like, oh, that's what that means. And so another example, Scott, that I have is the first time I did psychedelics, like I didn't even know that I had an ego. Like I never walked into a room thinking that I was better than anybody. In fact, the opposite was true. Every time I walked into a room, I was like, man, when I was in the SEAL teams, I felt like I was surrounded by real life living superheroes, and somehow I just got lucky, got like this backstage pass. Like, what am I doing here? So, yeah, even though I fought and clawed for 10 years to earn my way into that room, when I got there, I still didn't believe that I deserved to be there. And then when it was only through deeply experiencing my ego for how it was choosing to manifest itself, was like, oh, I do have an ego. If somebody would have told me that I had an ego years ago, Scott, I would have been like, you don't know who I am. You don't know me. You can't say that. And it was only because, in my case, it was only because of psychedelics that I learned that on a deep level, on a level that is aligned with truth. And so, yeah, that's what really helped me to be the catalyst.
Well, this seems like a good place to begin to go into your own journey into psychedelics. But before we walk down that road, I have to ask for a little bit of clarification there, because listening to this, look, when I hear ego, I think of especially having an ego, phrases like that. I associate it with being blunt, narcissism. People that walk around thinking that they're the center of the universe, that are divas, that put their own needs above the needs of the group, all of this sort of stuff, and that have an overinflated sense of their importance. You're telling me that you were basically viewing yourself as the opposite. So what on earth could having an ego look like in that context? I don't even understand.
Thank you for asking the question. So what you were saying at the beginning was always my understanding of what the ego was.
Yeah.
Well, what I came to understand later on, and if I haven't said this already, so I'm going to say this now, Scott. Nothing I say is completely right. I don't know what I'm talking about. I mean, I genuinely don't. Everything I know has either been in my experience, somebody else told me, my perspective, whatever. But I don't, when I get to the root of anything, I instantly don't know anything. So this is the way I understand it, for what it's worth. So the way I see ego now, in my experience with, sitting with it in this way, is it has a million different faces, and it can manifest in a million different ways, but all of the ways have something to do with some kind of limiting thought or behavior. So for example, and before I go any further from here, I just really, really want to say, because there seems to be like this big overwhelming energy flow of like, ego death, kill it, just eradicate ego from your life. And I don't know necessarily, number one, that that's true, or number two, that that's even a good idea. Because the way that I see the ego is that it is my great teacher. Without the ego, then I would never really be driven to grow and develop. The classic saying of like, you cannot understand lightness without knowing the dark. You can't know what it is to be happy without being sad. So the ego, whether you walk into a room and say, hey, everybody, you're welcome, but I'm here because I'm awesome. Or you walk into a room and say, hey, I'm not sure I'm supposed to be here. I'm stupid, or I'm whatever. Each one of those things, when you start to peel away the layers of the onion, come back to a place of falseness, right? So somebody walk into a room, they're no more special or important than anyone else who has ever lived. But they need to say that. And I am generalizing here, I realize that, but they need to say that in order to protect themselves because of how they may feel about themselves on a subconscious level. I need to make sure that I'm explaining to you who I am, because if I don't, you could see me for the fraud that I am. And then the same is true with somebody who walks into a room and says, I'm not, I don't deserve to be here. Well, that's equally as false, because we all deserve to be everywhere.
Wow.
It's, just the fact that you got here at all. So when you start to peel away those layers and you get to a deeper truth, what it is when you're talking about ego, it's like you were saying, it's like this overinflation of self or individualization, as though we are all not connected somehow. But it takes the ego in order to do that, so that you can understand that we are all connected, that we all belong here.
It's an interesting point, and I actually have been guilty of this sort of egotism that is masked as anti-egotism. Right? Like I all the time feel as though I shouldn't be in a room. I'm with all these incredible, phenomenal people. Why am I sitting here? And you're right. By actually having those thoughts, particularly if I act on those thoughts, I'm creating a separation between myself and those individuals. And that is, quite obviously, after hearing what you just said, an act of over ego expression. With all of this in mind, then, how did you end up in the world of psychedelics?
Yeah, so I retired in 2018 from the teams, Scott, and then and after that, I got to ask myself the coolest question anybody can ask: like, hey, if I could do anything in the world, what would it be? And over the course of my career, the most common question I was asked while I was active duty from corporate executives is, how is it that you work and communicate so well together in the SEAL teams? For whatever reason, there seems to be this idea that the SEALs are among the most elite performing teams in the world. Mm-hmm. So I would get those questions a lot. And what I found myself doing often was not only adding or responding in things that I knew well that the SEALs did, that I believe, man, if everybody does this, performance, all that stuff is just going to skyrocket. But I also found myself adding things that I knew well that we didn't do. Things like deep connection to the self and empathy and compassion, things that you might understand aren't necessarily of really key importance on the battlefield. And they really weren't as a warfighter. But as a human, they're hugely integral. And so when I got the chance to do anything in the world, and we started the Trident Approach, and that's what we did. We started to talk about this, what I thought was a full spectrum approach to not only leadership, but leading the self, not only leading teams, but leading the self. And about a year later, one of my pathfinders wants me, he's like, Diego, I'm not going to be at the meeting next week. I'm going down to Mexico. There's an organization called Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions, vetsolutions.org, who take Navy SEALs down to Mexico and treat them with psychedelics to treat them for post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injury, chemical addiction, depression, suicide, and all that. And he was stacked up pretty good with PTS. So I'm like, all right, brother, man, let me know how it goes. Good journey. And I didn't know anything about psychedelics. I don't know, do any of that stuff, whatever. And when he came back, I was like, hey, how'd it go? It's like, I have to introduce you to these guys. So I went down there along with vets, also with the mission within. And they kind of showed me the program that they had. And they actually took me to Mexico And there were a few of the guys down there. I'll tell you, our community is really small, so it's very, very, very easy to bump into guys whenever it is we get together. And I just so happened to see, as fate would have it, probably about the most notorious guy I know in the SEAL teams, who was the biggest, baddest guy. I mean, as aggressive as SEALs can be, even the aggressive SEALs were kind of reeling him in on target.
Really?
So you can't do that. And he was not born an American citizen. He was, later on became an American citizen. And so, we'll pull him off on target. Like, dude, you can't do that. He's like, you're Americans. You're here to play patty cake. I'm from this country. I'm going to win the war.
Wow.
So the whole point of that whole thing is, if ever there was somebody who had seen, committed, witnessed some of the worst things that human beings can experience, it was this person. And I saw him go through 5-MeO DMT. And it was traumatic. Actually, I didn't see him. I heard him because I was in another room, and everything that was kind of going on was kind of reverberating through the walls. And I was like, what is going on out there? It's crazy. And then when he was done, I got a knock on my door and said, hey, Diego, you're up. I was like, what? I think, what are you talking about? I'm just here to observe. They're like, hey, we got a dose if you want it. And I'm very lucky, Scott. Like, I don't have post-traumatic stress. I don't have any traumatic brain injury that I know. I just got very, very lucky time in the career.
Right.
And they knew this, but they asked me anyway. So I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. And as I was walking out of my room, he was walking towards me with his arms around his therapist. And he looked at me and he's like, I'm going to have a better life. And I was like, what? What? Because I just heard, an exorcism going on in the next room. Like, I was, whatever.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've got to ask, since you mentioned it, like, what exactly were you hearing? Were you hearing screaming or I'm imagining all sorts of things. I don't know if they're true.
You got
really?
It. Screaming, cussing as loud as you can, just, you could hear things kind of being shuffled around as though, there was some erratic movement going on. And we were in this beautiful villa on the coast of Mexico overlooking the ocean. And it was a compound. So he was like in the main structure of this house. And I was like outside of that, saying across the pool and then into my own other separate, like almost like little casita. And I could hear all of this. Like, I must have been 30 feet away from the structures in between, and he's screaming. So I was afraid. I was like, man, like, what is going on?
Yeah. So I would have been terrified too.
Yeah. It was so earth-shattering to have in my mind probably exactly what you had in your mind of kind of what was going on over there. And as soon as I came across to him, he looked at me and said, I'm going to have a better life. It was so crazy. Like, the dichotomy, the whole thing was just nuts. But it was good because it kind of gave me some, some peace, because I knew that I was about to follow in. And what I kept telling myself was, well, I know this dude has more to work with than I do. Like, I'm good. And then, which was true in a way. I went through myself, and I didn't scream at all. But what I did do, I later found out there are these things that are called dragon breaths, where I was just exhaling like to a factor of like 20, just over and over and over again, the hardest, deepest, longest exhales I could imagine. And, in 15 minutes, I came out of the medicine, and the first words that I was able to utter was, I looked up at Dr. Martin Polanco with the Mission Within. I looked up at him and I was like, how can I help you? How can I help? Because it instantly transformed my whole understanding of literally everything. Who I am, what I am, who we all are, where we are, like in an instant. 5-MeO DMT is the most powerful psychedelic that we know of in the world. And there's a reason for that, because, it takes you to a place where you are in an egoless state. So the burdens of life and this whole idea of growing and all this, just imagine like every imaginable burden off of you. every capsulization, every confinement, all just gone. And I, just like everything else, I could be wrong, but in my mind, it is the one psychedelic that brings us closer to the threshold of where we actually are in true existence, not at all in this world. And so I think that's why it's the most powerful even though it lasts only a couple of minutes. I mean, I've done other psychedelics that last 16 hours, and they're very, very strong and really powerful, but nothing is like that in my mind. So that was my experience, and that's how we ended up getting started.
But I've got to ask, hearing something like this, do you remember what did you see? What did you feel? What were you experiencing between the time when your session started and you woke up having had this revelation? I can't even begin to fathom this. Or do you even remember it? Did you just wake up and have this revelation?
I remember much of it. There's no real way to tell whether I remember all of it, but I do have clear memories of it. And I just want to be careful about, talking about, because there's some people who are going to be listening to Webdelics and they're going to be like, okay, that's it. After this story, Diego said this is what he saw, so I'm going to go do that. And, I'm going to see what he saw.
Well, we're going to talk about that in a minute. So thank you for that.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So really just trying to be very careful with managing expectations that people are just getting into the space. So I'll just be really brief and say that my first time with 5-MeO, it showed me that the things that I had thought that I had let go of and kind of dropped, and just moved on with my life were right with me, like a pistol in a holster, just right attached right to my hip. They didn't go anywhere. I sat there and tried to trick myself, the entire part of my adult life and saying, that was in the past. It doesn't matter anymore. But I was unwittingly, I was lying to myself because it 100% did still matter to me, but I didn't know how to heal it. So, and I think that's another big thing, especially getting back to leadership. It's like being able to see somebody who's not healed and helping them and assisting them through an actual healing process. It's probably one of the biggest gifts you can actually give anybody. But everything starts with the self. So I was recognizing that I was not even forgiving myself. I wasn't forgiving other people in my life who just interacted with me just as a function of being alive. So what it showed me was what it actually meant to actually let something go beyond like this conscious decision, to just from like I use this word cellular level, just a cellular level, just setting the bags down, thanking it for what it was and moving on free. I didn't know how to do that. I didn't even know that was a thing. I thought that was just the end of it. Hey, let it go. Okay, it's let go.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way.
I think a lot of people think that.
And I did for sure. In the very beginning of my awareness of what was going on in the medicine, I did, for my part, happen to experience what everybody talks about in terms of being in this egoless state and just who we all are. So that combined with a couple other things happened to be my experience that time with 5-MeO. I've done 5-MeO 7 times, and it's a strange thing because the medicines, they're all, they all have different personalities and different things or whatever, but I've never met anybody, and it hasn't been in my experience either, where I could do the same medicine and get the same experience. It's almost like, it's like music, so rock and roll, there's a million different songs, but for sure that's rock and roll. And there's R&B,
right?
It's the same thing. So there's definitely there's a flavor to it that's maybe unmistakable, but no matter what, every time I've done 5-MeO, it's been really profoundly different.
So before we get into the next question, I do want to make it 100% clear. You ended up having this first experience not as the result of seeking help with a specific disorder.
That's correct.
But because you were in the vicinity of where this experience was going on. And the reason why I ask that is because what you're talking about then is, I don't want to say an accidental exposure to it, but an exposure that wasn't self-directed to specifically heal. As a more or less self-perceived intact person, you realized through the process that you had that there was healing that needed to go on. Am I understanding that correctly?
100% correct. The reason why I was really down there in the beginning was the mission within was looking for a CEO. And because of their clientele being in special operations and specifically with the Navy SEALs and my background, and I was CEO of the leadership thing and all that, they were like, hey, would you be interested in being a CEO for us? And I was like, I don't do drugs, bro.
Yeah.
So, and they're like, hey, it's not like that. Trust us. That's not what it is. And why don't you come down and see for yourself what it is. I ended up not taking the job, but what I ended up doing instead, because there's just so much obviously that goes into supporting an organization in that way. And of course, we already had our organization. So I ended up becoming a psychedelic reintegration coach so that I could go down with the mission within every weekend or on weekends and just sit with other veterans who were going through and in their healing process. They could have sort of like a liaison between the world that they know and this, spiritual world that they were going into.
So there are a number of threads in the statements that you just made that I'm going to try and pick up and then tie back together without forgetting the issue that we're ultimately going to return to of which psychedelic you started your journey with. Let's go with, to start, your statement to them, which is kind of a statement I might have. At least I might have had before I started doing the show, and I bet a lot of people listening to or watching to the show will have, which is a leader that they know or a leadership position that they're asked to be in might have a component, might have a history of, or some sort of suggestion along the way that psychedelics be involved. And honestly, if I were to hear that a leader that I might work for, especially let's say they were a politician, had been doing psychedelics or was doing psychedelics, again, especially before I began this show, my reaction would be very similar to yours. I don't do drugs. I don't want my leader doing drugs. I'll be honest, again, speaking in a very extreme fashion here, I have in my mind this image of the President of the United States regularly doing psychedelics and then walking over to press the nuclear button. What do you say to someone who might be feeling those sorts of things?
One of the big lessons that I got from psychedelics is converting myself from a place of knowing to a place of curiosity. When I realized deeply, where it became in my experience that I don't actually know anything, my only choice was to then be curious about everything. And so, for example, if someone were to come to me and talk about something that I sort of knew, but not really, and they said something that kind of contrasted with what my preconceived ideas are, or whatever. In the past, I might have tried to defend my ego and saying, that's not true. What I know to be true is this. But because of psychedelics and the work that I've been able to do, and through the help of all many integration people serving for me, is I don't know anything anyway. So if you can get into this place where you're panicked or panic stricken or worried that someone in your leadership or somebody in your family or maybe even your children are doing psychedelics, one of the most powerful things you can do is just be aware of how you're responding and see if you can just be curious I wonder what this is. Maybe there's more for me to learn. Maybe there's more for me to understand. And talking about leadership and not talking about psychedelics. Imagine if you're leadership, like you walked into a room and say, hey, this is the situation that happened. And instead of them being like, I know this, or instead of that, they were like, I wonder what that's all about. It changes everything. And so many things. And one of them includes feeling safe, which is one of the key elements that somebody needs in order to stay and perform at a job, is the feeling of safety and security. A lot of people who are operating from this place of knowing, there is no safety, because if you violate something that they think they know, you're in trouble.
So then maybe you could tie this in a little bit more explicitly to using psychedelics as a leadership development modality. What does that look like practically? If I'm about to get promoted somewhere that's a new level of leadership for me, and I want to consider this as something that may help me be a better leader, what would that even look like?
So we have it in our minds what we think is important. Like, this is the answer that I need. This is what I need to do. And the best way that I know how to explain that is that there's a country song that was released back in the 90s, like sometimes I thank God for unanswered prayers, which means that there may be a higher knowing, there might be a higher awareness. So if you go, I'm going to do psychedelics so that I can do this, the end results might be like, yeah, thank you so much for your input. You're going to do this instead, So the whole idea behind that is psychedelics also help me transition from a state of being in expectation to a state of setting intentions and just leaving it. So what I would like, I wouldn't recommend anybody go into psychedelic. Like I'm deliberately going into this psychedelic experience so that I can become a better leader. There's more important things. There's deeper lessons learned, because leadership always, to me, illustrates some kind of, or it really focuses on something external, other people. How do I serve and all this kind of stuff. And one of the biggest problems I think that we have in our culture is we think that it's a selfish thing, taking care of ourselves, which I get it. I mean, I was raised that way too, but literally nothing could be more damaging. I call it selfful, where you're being selfful. Like I'm being aware, I'm being conscious, I'm being deliberate on taking care of me, so that maybe one day I can be a really strong pillar for somebody else. So all of this is a really long way to say, if for whatever reason you feel like psychedelics are right for you, what is it within me that I can learn, or that I can heal, or that I can begin to know, or something, and leave it at that. Because what ends up happening there is you get this whole download of all this stuff, all this really important stuff. And then what you find out over time with integrating all of those lessons is that it just happens to apply to leadership. It just happens to apply to personal performance. Like, that's the key, because we stand on these broken legs trying to support other broken people, and we just don't last long. So heal the self, empower the self, develop the self, and you'll see the aftermath of what happens to the world around you when you start from that place.
There is an elegance to this part of the conversation in light of the conversation that we've had so far, because I'm seeing it circle right back up to what we talked about at the top of the hour, which is alignment with truth. And what I'm hearing is that if psychedelics can align you with your truth, then the leadership abilities, particularly the healthy, constructive leadership abilities that I hope most people aspire to, will flow from that. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yes. That's it.
Diego, I love it. Thank you. Diego, let me ask you a little bit about two other things. First of all, reintegration. Explain to us a little bit about what reintegration looks like to you and why that is important, particularly within the context of this conversation vis-a-vis leadership.
It is the most important thing. Going around and doing psychedelics without any guidance, without any support, without any preparation, without anything, at some point it just becomes a game. Or maybe that's not fair to say, but you're missing out on so much. Like, I've had conversations about psychedelics with people who are deadheads in the 60s, and they have no idea what I'm talking about, because they're like, hey, here's some mushrooms, let's go get jacked up and go and just trip out. And I have nothing, there genuinely is no judgment here or whatever, but it is interesting to have conversations with them because they don't know what I'm talking about, like these overwhelmingly powerful healing mechanisms. Well, I go into the medicine, and thanks to the mission within, and thanks to vets, I was essentially raised in the world of psychedelics by treating them as a healing modality, a healing mechanism, a teaching mechanism. So I've only ever done, up to this point in my life, I'm not saying it's a wrong thing to do, I'm not saying, but it's nothing like that. But up to this point in my life, I have only ever done psychedelics in order to heal, learn, or grow. So without the integration, it can just be like this trippy drug experience, in and out and gone. And almost it sometimes can also be really traumatic if you don't know why it is that you're seeing demons flying at you. That can be a very, very traumatic thing. So I have this story that I love to tell because I think that it puts it in a really good context. So if you can imagine Leif Erikson, the Norwegian Viking, sailing across the Atlantic on his way, being the first European to discover North America and Canada. What psychedelics does is, if you can imagine him being in the ship, psychedelics comes and it picks up Leif, and then it takes him to Canada, and then it puts him down in the ground and says, look around, see the trees, see the hills, and grabs some dirt, and it puts the dirt in Leif's hands. And you feel the dirt? You got it? He's like, okay, now you get Leif back up, cross the Atlantic, put him down on the ship, and says, there you go. It's still up to Leif to manage his crew, figure out what's going on with the weather, make sure that his ships are still on course and all that stuff. He still has to do what he's doing, but the difference is he knows where he's going. He's seen it. So there's, he knows what's happening over there. And the thing is, with what integration does is it helps connect the two. Because especially if you're just brand new or you don't have any really spiritual muscles developed, it could it could be really, really, truly overwhelming. But somebody whose sole purpose is to hear you and your experience and help you kind of connect the dots within your own life experience as to why it even matters at all, or how some of this stuff can actually go about healing you. It brings a sense of understanding to those of us who simply are not capable in this moment of really understanding what we actually experienced. Without it, it essentially is chaos, which is fine. It's all part of it. But if you really want to maximize, if you really deeply want to heal, integration is very nearly mandatory, in my opinion.
Let's go back to one final topic before we wrap up. You used a very specific drug during your first experience, and it is one that is, as people who have listened to or watched other episodes of this show will know, very, very strong, very powerful, and not always one that is recommended for someone who is having their first experience. And I want to just discuss that briefly because, as you hinted at earlier, it's entirely possible that someone might listen to this episode in isolation, which I don't recommend that anyone do. All of our episodes are great and worth listening to or watching. But in the event this is where you're starting and saying, okay, I'm going to go and find this particular experience and have it. And you were hedging a little bit around that. So maybe you could just talk about why.
Yeah, so psychedelics it's a perfect, segue from our last thing. Without integration, without this really intentional, piece in place, you know, there are just as many lost people there are just as many people who are lost in the world of psychedelics as in any other industry anywhere. So there are many, many places to get 5-MeO. There are many, many places to do 5-MeO that may not necessarily be the healthiest of places or the cleanest of medicines or the more supportive of environments. So when you do 5-MeO, if you are able to fully release to the medicine, which is a skill in and of itself, I don't know, it's a skill, but something that seems like it has to be developed a little bit. But to fully release to the medicine, you are 100% vulnerable. 100% vulnerable. I've had, because you don't know, many people act completely different. Like I said, I was exhaling really hard, but fairly quiet. Other people are yelling and screaming. Other people are urinating. Other people like we've
Wow.
had people stand up from the mattress and try to run through a wall.
Wow.
And I've had many times where I've had to, subdue these huge Navy SEALs and just get them on the ground just to protect them because they're hitting their heads and all this stuff. And they come out of the medicine. They're like, man, I got a headache and my throat is sore. Why is that? Like they have no idea what they were doing. Like they just don't know what they were doing.
Wow.
So it has to be in these protected places where you are surrounded by people who love you, who care about you and who are supporting you. Because I think I heard that you can get 5-MeO on Amazon or something like that. And I'm like, oh man, okay, just so you know, if it really is real 5-MeO, you don't know what you would do, and you could really hurt yourself or hurt other people without even knowing it. So I do know places that are like, hey, here you go, like have a good time. There's no. The negative part about psychedelics being illegal is that there's no regulation. The positive thing about psychedelics being not legal is that there is no regulation. But so it's, if you want to be good to yourself, should you decide, I would say, just like if you're going to go on a vacation somewhere, do your research. Like, hey, what are the reviews? What do people say about this? Who do I know that maybe have gone through this? So that if you do decide to do this medicine, you're in a safe place, you're in a good place, and those people are simply there just to serve you and however you need to be served. And it's crazy, but that's not as common as one would think in the area of psychedelics.
Diego, there has truly been a lot to ponder, hearing everything that you had to say. And I, for one, am going to probably be spending a lot of time truly processing everything that you said. One thing that I'm going to take away from this is what I mentioned earlier, understanding leadership as aligning with your truth and then moving from there, and then thinking about psychedelics as a tool to be able to do that, even if, as you mentioned earlier, I'm not even realizing that misalignment is there. If there's one final takeaway that you would share with the audience today, what would yours be?
If I had a chance to say anything to anyone, someone actually asked me today, what's your favorite psychedelic quote? And my favorite psychedelic quote is, psychedelics are to the mind what the microscope is to biology and the telescope is to astronomy. And that was from Dr. Stanislav Grof.
Wow.
And so if in the spirit of kind of, putting psychedelics into a more clear perspective as to maybe what they might widely be thought of, thinking about it in that context, it really changed a lot of things for me. And it opened my heart to this whole thing, or just allowing it to be instead of resisting. Well, this doctor who was a psychiatrist for like 40 years learned more on psychedelics in 4 hours than he did in 20 years of psychotherapy. That must mean something. So they're not as scary as I think they're made out to be, but they're still very, very powerful, and they demand a lot of respect and a lot of love don't go. That's probably one more thing that I would say is we're not meant to do this alone. If you are on this journey, whatever it is, whether it be healing or you just want to learn and grow and develop, doing it by yourself, there's so much that can be missed. So do this with somebody you love, and you trust, and you'll see sort of the returns coming back several times over.
Beautifully put. Diego, after watching or hearing this conversation, many people are going to want to know a lot more about you. What do you have going on in your life that folks might want to know about, and where can people get more information about you?
Yeah, so the vast majority of my time is spent with our company, the Trident Approach, where we kind of combine the best of what we learned in the SEAL teams along with our deepest insight and psychedelic understanding. We don't give psychedelics with the Trident Approach. We just share the lessons learned that we got from them. And then I spend a smaller portion of my time. I officially am a psychedelic reintegration coach with Heroic Hearts Project. So where we take veterans, whether it's special operations or not, we take veterans down to Peru and do ayahuasca, and really help them recover from a lot of their traumas and experiences in life there. And so, yeah, if you wanted to reach out, my email is diego@tridentapproach.com. And then we have a book basically just aligned with our talk today that's in our initial editing process now. So we think it's going to come out early next year. It really is just the psychedelic leadership, the effects that plant medicine can have on deeper alignment with the self and in performing teams.
Love it. And just so it is clear to anyone who may be listening to or watching this show, this is being recorded in late 2022. Next year is going to be 2023, and this show may be released at that time. And so by the time you hear or watch this, you should check out and see whether that book is actually in release, because it might have been released by then. Diego, thank you so much for being on the show today, for your insights and your wisdom. It's been revelatory. I'll just say that. And for those who are listening or watching, keep tuning in for more episodes as we continue to dig deeper and deeper into what psychedelics mean for each of us personally, and what they mean for us as a culture, how it all ties together, and where that may take us. It's exciting stuff. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to learn more, be sure to subscribe, leave a review or a comment, and tell the folks that you care about what we're doing. Don't forget to follow Webdelics on LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and be sure to check out our website at webdelics.com. That's WEBDELICS.com. Then sign up to get our blog with trusted information about psychedelics and plant medicine. Then join us next time for another episode of the Webdelics podcast.